the discussions we're having. I think another thing that are important as on the roadside is fancy intro. And fancy introductions are sometimes very cool in debates. We're just going to talk that as the last thing we're going to talk about in this particular class. So the next discussion we're going to have is the journey for impact. And this is very, very important. How do you impact debate? The central idea is you can brainstorm impacts that are important, but secondly, that are closely related to the round, and then try to backfill in the analysis. I'm going to explain this. Let's assume we are opposition, and then the motion is this house would pay. Let's assume we are opposition, and then the motion is this house will pay non-gang members to not commit violent crime. This house will pay non-gang members to not commit violent crimes. The first question we ask ourselves on up is, what impacts can we search for in this particular motion? What are the impacts that we would search for? So the first impact we can discuss, so yes, let's make this a very open section. So what impact can we search for in this particular motion? This house will pay on up. What do you think are the impact we seek to achieve? This house will pay non-gang members to not commit violent crime. Can I confirm we are together on?
It's going to happen on the 31st. Okay, so that's fine.
Just let me clarify with you, Enoch. Is Esther yet on the call or not yet? My phone did shut down. This is Rin.
Oh, all right. She's not on call. I don't see her.
Okay, just give me about a minute or two. Let me just call her directly.
All right.
Yeah, I just go to Esther, so she's just joining in like about a minute or two. Okay, yeah, great. So Esther is here. Apologies again. I'm on the road. My phone ran out of battery, but nonetheless, I want to thank AC for accepting and honoring this invite. So it came in on short notice as well to share your expertise with us. Proud of Esther as well for her commitment to things like growth and ensuring that she shares knowledge broadly. She's made finals a couple of tournaments, good judge as well. These days, I do call her coach, and she was asking previously when she did become a coach. But yeah, I told her, well, because then again, you're able to inspire people in rounds and probably you have the teachability skill. I think then that is like what coaching most likely looks like. Either way, you're most welcome. Esther, we just like have a word or two from the convener of this year's Mashariki edition, and that is Enoch, and then we can just start off right now. Yeah, over to you, Enoch.
All right. So I had already spoken prior to Rin's joining, so I would just welcome our trainer for tonight's session. Esther, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much for the invite. It's an honor having to be here. I don't really have much to say. So I am just going to go right ahead into why I'm here today, and hopefully we make the best out of it. And my approach to having to talk to people about stuff is I would like everyone to listen to everything I say from the point of view of not being rigid. Yeah, you don't have to be rigid about it. Um, the best way to learn is always to consider things, look at what to pick in terms of what is important to your growth or what you necessarily need to do better as a debater. And then please, with your full chest and with boldness, drop those that you think either you are not comfortable with or at the end of the day doesn't necessarily makes you the better speaker you want to be. So a mistake most times that people make whenever they attend debate sessions like this is in your next couple of speeches or tournaments, you always want to try to rigidly fit all of those things you've heard into your speeches. At the end of the day, debate growth or your growth as a debater ends up being more progressive than linear kind of. So it means there are points in time where you try some things and it doesn't necessarily work out. So it means that self-evaluation is always very important. Yeah, we are thinkers, right? We are philosophical people. We always want to check out things that work for us and things that don't work for us and necessarily pick those that are beneficial to us. So yeah, I have given enough of Aspire to Maguire this evening. So quickly, I am going to just talk about myself before I also introduce what we have to talk about today. I am Olayinka Olamide Esther. Most people call me Esther. And like I said, it's an honor to be here. And most people from Uganda are my friends, starting from Rin to Cynthia to Dennis. Unfortunately, I can't see anybody I truly know here. But either ways, I'm happy to meet you all. And hopefully one of these days I'm going to be in Uganda to see all of you physically. Yeah, that being said, okay, yeah, I know Enoch. That's true. I know Enoch. And yeah, hoping to see you all physically or as well. You're all welcome to Nigeria to meet your favorite Nigerian debaters. Yeah. That being said, let's go right ahead into what I have to say today. I am probably going to share my screen. Okay, no, I'm not going to do that. Most of the things I wrote here is quite personal. Okay, yeah, that being said, the topic today is mastering engagement and concessions and weighing debates. So it's kind of like two things made into a sentence. First, it is mastering engagement and concessions. And then secondly, it is weighing debates. So it's like a two-in-one kind of topic. And hopefully we get to talk about every of the parts of this topic. This topic is quite personal to me due to my experiences in most tournaments where I have had poor or bad performances. And that's the thing about debate, right? Though most times you hope to have very good experiences, probably break top, maybe break on a perfect point, be the best speaker, probably get to finals or win the tournament. There are particularly times where you probably don't even get to break, or you break, but maybe at quarterfinals or octofinals or semifinals, as the case might be, you drop out, you probably don't make finals. There are times where you probably don't make top 10 speakers, and you know those things can quite be hurtful, considering the fact that most times people put a whole lot of effort and make a whole lot of sacrifices to have to either participate in tournaments or just generally, you know, be the best in debates or tournaments, as the case might be. Considering the fact that most of you are here, it means that you're probably sacrificing something else to be here. But either ways, there are points in time where you necessarily still have bad or poor performances. And personally for me, those are times where I have to introspect, or I have to introspectively look at my performance, probably look at training sessions I've attended, what are the things they told me I necessarily didn't yield to, or things I'm yielding to that are still not benefiting me. And most times, one of the critical things I always look at is that this topic, engagement and concessions or weighing debates, are always things that influences the extent to which I win a round. And you know, this has always made me then look at how exactly do I get better with debates, or how exactly do I then get better with, based on these experiences I've had as a debater with a poor performance in a tournament. And one thing I first realized is debate is more conversational than we most of the time think of it to be. A lot of times, people see debate as just coming to throw arguments around, coming to probably savage your opponent, and then, you know, jump out of the call. But a lot of times, people don't pay attention to the fact that it's a conversation in which you're trying to influence the thoughts or ideas of people listening to you, especially the judges, to buy them into thinking about things that you are saying and believe those things you are saying. That necessarily means that most times debate isn't just about having to win the round, having to come first or second, or not having to take the foot. It is about necessarily conviction, or, you know, having a conversation with somebody and making them believe you. That means that you have to be relaxed, you have to be diplomatic, you have to be logical, and you have to be very convincing. And that is kind of like my introduction into the topic today. For you to be convincing, you have to master engagement and concessions. You also have to master weighing debates. At the end of this debate session or this training session, I hope that you will get my point of view as to how to probably be more conversational with your debate by generally just making engagements that are easy to follow up, or concessions that are very strategic in the debate, and most importantly, weighing your debate in a way that strategically places you to either take first or second within that debate, essentially. So I decided to split this training session into two parts. The first part is on mastering engagement and concessions, and then the second part is on winning debates. So the first thing you need to understand whenever you are talking about, whenever you want to make your debate more conversational, is the very fact that you cannot run your debate in isolation. That is a mistake that most people used to make in debate tournaments or when participating in debate rounds. You just read the topic, this house will ban something or this house will legalize something, and you just go right ahead without probably looking at how to engage this debate or thinking about what the opposing team is probably going to say, how they will probably look at the debate, what is the largest argument that probably comes from the opening or closing teams, and all of those. This necessarily tells you that engagement and concessions start from your prep time. Whenever the motion is being read out to you, and you're probably with your partner trying to discuss that particular motion in itself. The first thing you probably have to think of is, one, what is the basic problem in this debate? Or what is the context in which this debate is existing? And how exactly do we come into this debate, especially if you are in the closing team? In the opening team, you can probably run, flatline arguments and you probably still be winning the debate. But in the closing team, for you to have to win the debate, you most of the time have to provide contexts that are so logical and contexts that are so convincing to make judges and other speakers to probably buy your arguments or buy your thoughts, as the case might be. So it means that from prep time, you have to be asking yourself two critical questions. What is the biggest problem in this debate? Or what is the most important problem in this debate? Or what is this motion trying to solve? And then how exactly do I and my partner position our speech in a way that necessarily engages with this problem? But then you can now be asking this secondary question of what is the biggest opposition case towards this particular motion? And how exactly are we able to engage this particular opposition case? Do we give a rebuttal? What type of arguments can we probably run? How do we structure our arguments? What do we prioritize at the end of the day? Most of the times, these are things that you and your partner should be asking each other, rather than having to list 5, 10, 12 arguments you probably want to matter dump, or trying to define a particular word that you think might necessarily be important. So a typical example you can give here is probably, let's use this classic example that we always use in debate sessions. This has to ban abortion. So probably you're in the opening government team. The question you should be asking yourself is, why would we want to ban abortion? Why is there a problem with abortion right now? What is the biggest argument opposition is going to make as to why they don't want to necessarily ban abortion? So there are plethora of reasons, you can give as to why you don't want to ban abortion, ranging from ethical reasons to moral reasons to practical reasons. There are a lot of reasons you can necessarily give. But you realize that you and your partner probably have a combined 14 minutes to have to give arguments as to why you don't want it to be banned. That makes you realize that even if you have 8 arguments, you probably can run the whole 8 arguments in your combined 14 minutes. That necessarily tells you essentially that there is now a need for you to probably make things like prioritization, probably do things like picking the most relevant arguments. That is where the question of what is the biggest issue from opposition side then becomes important. Okay, even if opposition run this, do you think closing opposition can look at it from this point of view? You most of the time at the end of the day find out that even if you have 8 possible arguments, you and your partner are then beginning to weed it down to probably 2 broad arguments or 3 basic arguments that probably gives you a higher chance of winning the debate. It means that you've just mastered the art of engagement, even right from, your prep time, essentially. But then, there are 2 things you need to realize about also not running your debate in isolation. The very fact that after your prep time, when the debate starts, you probably have to do 2 things. You and your partner might probably be at a point in time have to either agree to disagree, which most of the times is concessions, or you have to agree from the get-go. What does that mean? There is a thing called fiat in debate at the end of the day. Fiat necessarily means that a particular action that is being talked about in the debate, in the motion, can be carried out and will be carried out. So, for example, this house will ban abortion. It necessarily means that the fiat in that particular debate is that banning in itself is something that can be done and something that will be done essentially. It means that you have to concede, whether you are a proposition team or opposition team, that banning will occur. The question there becomes, where is the point of engagement in that particular debate? Because as the opposition team, it means that your argument can necessarily not be banning is not feasible. You can't ban because banning is not possible, or whatever reason you might probably want to give as to why banning will not occur. That is a very, very unfair engagement to be making from an opposition team, or as a proposition team in a motion where you say this house will ban abortion. You begin to place a burden on the opposition side to go against that fiat, probably to justify to you why banning will not be able to occur. Like that in itself is a very unfair engagement to be happening in a particular debate. So it means that whenever there is a fiat going on in a particular motion, which exists in almost every motion you most likely find on earth, it means that you probably have to have a concession to agree on a very basic level that the particular action in that motion can be carried out and will be carried out essentially. So, for example, this house will probably create schools that teaches in endangered indigenous languages. Everybody in that debate, whether opening government or closing government, opening opposition or closing opposition, have to concede that the creation of those schools in itself is something that is going to occur and something that can occur. So please, as a judge, it is always so easy to rank a team down whenever they're trying to go against this fiat, whenever they are trying to not concede. It means that at that point in time, no matter the team you are within that particular debate, you have to be to disagree. So now, back to the question I asked as to where exactly do we then have engagement particular problems that are existing within society. Like I said, in a motion that says this house will ban abortion, there is a plethora of reasons or plethora of problems that exist around abortion, both on the positive and negative side. The question then becomes, will banning be able to solve all of these issues that are existing around abortion? Obviously, on the proposition side, your answer will be yes, banning solves the problem. On the opposition side, your answer will obviously be no, banning doesn't solve this problem essentially. This necessarily tells you at the end of the day that you are at that point of time agreeing that banning will happen or can happen, but disagreeing that it is going to solve that particular issue. So that necessarily tells you that on the opposition side, you can now begin to run argument like, oh, even if you ban, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will not go to black markets to go and carry out abortion. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will control unwanted pregnancies, and all those particular arguments you necessarily think of the opposition side essentially. But the second thing you can probably also look at is the very fact that there are points in time where you just generally agree with everything. Like there is no point in time where you necessarily have to disagree. And that is where another way consensus can also exist. At that point in time is most of the time or create a rebuttals. That necessarily means that there's a structure as to which rebuttals exist. And rebuttals always have to be targeted. It means that you either have to look at what is the biggest premise or the biggest framework or the biggest definition that necessarily comes from this particular theme, and how exactly do we show that that particular definition in itself is something that is not wrong or something that doesn't necessarily lead to all of the impacts they talk about. And how do you necessarily know arguments, or how exactly do you necessarily know things you need to engage with, things you need to look at from your opposing team and necessarily targetly or rebut in a targeted manner? One, you have to look at things that, or you have to look at arguments that has the biggest impact on the opposite team. So you most of the time find some teams make some arguments that gives them like 6 to 8 or even 10 impacts, like layers and layers of impact. You most of the time obviously know that this is one of the biggest arguments that this team necessarily has. And it means that even if they can probably have little side arguments, most of the time you should understand that taking out that very big argument most of the time necessarily means taking out the crux of their case. So you probably have to look at the mechanisms that they give, or look at the definitions they give, or the context they give around that argument, and probably just prove how it is flawed essentially. But most importantly, another way you can also look at things you need to engage with, or arguments that you need to engage with in a targeted manner, are arguments that teams spend a whole lot of time trying to analyze or trying to explain. So you find out that a particular team, out of their 14 minutes speaking time, can probably use over 8 to 10 minutes trying to analyze a particular framework or a particular argument to show why it should make them win the debate. You should know that this particular team, this is the crux of their argument, and this is what we necessarily need to engage with. So it means that you need to targetedly rebut that particular argument. Note, this doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to engage any other type of arguments that they give. It just necessarily means that you need to make sure you place a priority on this type of arguments. One, arguments that they spend a whole lot of time making, but secondly, arguments that gives them the biggest or the most plenty arguments that they or impacts that they have within that particular debate essentially. It also means that another way you can also have some forms of engagement, or you can also not make concessions, is also to give things that they call counter propositions. This is always critical for the opposition speakers. That's either leader of opposition or deputy or member of opposition. That's opening opposition or closing opposition. That essentially means that whenever a particular team, essentially on the government side, comes up to give a particular definition in terms of context or framework, or generally just any form of definition, and you necessarily think that is an unfair definition that is either not engageable or just generally unfair, there is a need for you to come up and say, oh, panel, at the end of the day, you get this definition from the government team, but we necessarily think that is an unfair definition. You probably show why that definition is not realistic or cannot be engageable. Then you move on to show what the real context is. So for example, probably this house will ban smoking. And then the government team comes up and say, oh, smoking at the end of the day means generally roasting fish. Because I don't know if you can find that in Uganda, but in Nigeria, there is something we call smoked fish. And that is fish that is like roasted over fire. That means that a team can come and tell you, oh, that we want to ban smoked fish because this has to ban smoking. And smoking we're talking about here is probably the process of smoking fishes. We think that it deletes nutrients, and then they give probably some type of abstract argument. A typical way to engage to things like that is necessarily to come up and say, oh, panel, at the end of the day, smoking in itself is considered to be, inhaling gases from cigarettes or something of such, or, hard drugs and all of those. And we think that at the end of the day, that is a more engageable metric, as opposed to saying you want to ban smoking of fishes or smoking of meats, essentially. Because when you look at the impact smoking of cigarettes have in society, it means that we have to look for how to solve those particular problems. So should we ban it or should we not ban it? We on the opposition side are saying we don't want to ban it. This is just a way you've engaged or you've counter-propped a particular argument or definition that comes from the proposition side, essentially. What I have just done right now is to explain to you how you can engage particular debates, especially when you are not conceding to it. The most easiest, straightforward, and most obvious thing to do most of the time is always to give rebuttals, always to show why that particular argument coming from that particular team in itself is something that is flawed or something that is necessarily not true. But secondly, it's also to give things like counter proposition only when necessary, only always very easy to talk about, oh, this particular argument that came from this team is not true. Note, most of the time, it is always easier to say it is not true. And that's like a basic, like, surface level way of rebutting arguments. But then you should always take it to the next step of probably showing why a particular premise they talk about is most likely not going to happen. So probably a team is saying, oh, at the end of the day, we want to ban abortions because a lot of women probably die from abortion. So you can come up and say that's not necessarily true. Abortion doesn't always kill women. You probably have you say we have a lot of women who carry out abortion and still survive, so there is no delta, or we can as well still also claim that at the end of the day women carry out abortion and survive. But then panel, another thing you should also note is that abortion, even if, or rather death of women at the end of the day, is also something that is also caused by other things aside from just abortion. So you have women die because of plethora of health issues aside from just abortion. So if you necessarily say that you want to solve death of women within society, you probably have to also ban things like giving birth, because women also die from giving birth, something that is also considered to be a thing of joy in most societies or most communities. You realize that I have done two things here. One, I have shown to you why it is not true that abortion or all women die from abortion. But secondly, I have also proven to you that even though women die, it is not just from abortion alone. They also die from other reasons, or through other routes, or for other reasons. But lastly, you cannot have the even if analysis. When you listen to most debate rounds, you see speakers say, but panel, note, even if is also a way of probably making concessions in debate. Even if necessarily means that you're conceding or you're taking that particular team in their best case scenario. Even if all women die from abortion, banning it doesn't necessarily mean that abortion is going to stop. You probably still have women going back door to have abortions. You probably still have women going you probably have people still having unprotected sex with their partner. All those particular reasons. Even if just generally means that you're conceding at that particular point in time to that very brilliant argument that your opposing team is bringing, but generally just showing how it is weird for them to still have that particular logic. So you also find, which is something I think I do most of the time, you probably find me say something like, okay, let's even take this team at their best case scenario. Let's take it that everything they say is going to happen will happen in this debate. This is still why they are not winning the debate at the end of the day. It means that right now, I have just proved two major ways as to which you can necessarily have concessions or disagreements or engagements in a particular debate. One major way, which is always so common in debates, is by rebuttals. I have just shown you three ways, or the three levels to which you can take your rebuttals. First, which is the surface level, to say that that particular thing is not true. Secondly, to prove why it will not happen. But lastly, to give this even if concession, or to take them in their best case scenario and still show them why it doesn't lead to every of the solution they are probably talking about. But then the second way you can always have, engagement is most of the time by counter proposition, by generally just flipping their argument against them. So that generally means that whenever unfair definitions or context or arguments are given, you just generally show why that particular argument is so unfair and something that you necessarily think should not be a metric as to which debate is judged. So yeah, these are two basic ways as to which you can necessarily engage or generally just make concessions within a debate. That brings us to the first part of this particular session, which is mastering engagement and concessions. Before we move to the next session, which is weighing debates, if you have any questions, this would be the best time to probably ask your question. You can just generally unmute to ask.
Okay, thank you, Esther. I just have a question about fiat that you talked about earlier on. So you are a judge in a debate, and a proposition team is talking about probably let's say banning abortions, and the first opposition comes and calls them out and says that but then the second prop says that it will happen. So in such a debate, when you're possibly giving feedback to such a team, how do you go about that?
Okay. Yeah. I think the first thing to note at the end of the day about this particular, because if I should get your question right, it means that the first speaker comes to say it will happen, and then the second speaker comes to say it won't happen. That is a contradiction within that particular team. It necessarily means that the rule of judging within a particular debate is that whenever contradictions are made, you have to take the first stance that were given by the team generally. It means that you most likely have to take the first speaker stance, which is to say it is going to happen essentially. I don't know if this answers the question. Okay, sure. Okay, yeah. So just to reemphasize what my answer just says, and this is particularly to speakers, it is always important that whenever you are prepping, another way of making sure you master engagement is to make sure you and your partner are clear as to what your stance is within that particular debate. Understand what your burdens are, understand what your fiat is, and the extent to which your fiat can exist within that particular debate. And make sure that you and your partner are not coming to say different things, because it means it just reduces the likelihood of your team having to win or just generally fare well within that particular debate. Because if the first speaker's speech is to say, aha, this is going to happen, and then give a whole lot of argument as to how it's going to happen, and then the second speaker comes up and say that, oh, it's not going to happen, and then give a whole lot of reasons as to why it is not going to happen, it necessarily means to a very large extent that you've just reduced your team chances of having to be so relevant in the debate. Because rather than have 8 minutes worth of arguments for, or 8 minutes, 14 minutes, no, 16 minutes worth, no, 14 minutes worth of arguments. So sorry, 14 minutes worth of arguments as a contribution to the round. The judges are only able to take 7 minutes worth of argument. It means that your team probably don't have an extension or don't just generally have a contribution that from the last 7 minutes that is so relevant to the debate. So coming to now then weigh that up against another team that probably has full 14 minutes of materials. There's a possibility that they probably said things that are so critically injurious to the things that just came from 7 minutes. So the work of a second speaker is always to extend and advance things that has come from the first speaker. So please make sure that there is a homogeneity that is existing between you and your first speaker to be able to make sure to a very large extent that you are able to increase your chances of having to win the debate. Yeah, cool. So any other question before we move on to the second session? Any other question? Okay, yeah, Richard, you can ask a question. Yeah.
I have a question, please.
Okay, sure. Ask. Richard, ask your question, please. Richard, you're unfortunately not audible. I don't know why that is so.
Can you hear
So
me?
yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, for example, if it is in a debate round, say in a debate, there is this motion, for example, this house would abolish the executive arm of the government. What should be the
Um, okay, for some reasons I can't hear um the speaker, and unfortunately the speaker didn't get to the end of the question they were asking. So unfortunately, I don't know how to necessarily respond to that particular question. So hopefully before the call ends, the speaker joins back and then we'll be able to answer the question necessarily. In a debate that has a fiat, they could prop on whether the action is implemented with seven prop the mission. Okay, yeah, there's a question here that says in a debate that has fiat, I think Daniel already asked this, right? An opposition team calls the prop on whether the action is going to happen successfully, but the second proposition clarifies that the motion already gives the possibility of happening. As a judge, how then do you give feedback? Okay, yeah. I think this is going to make me branch slightly into mastering concessions and engagement as a judge. One thing you also need to understand as a judge is you cannot judge the debate in isolation. So many a times as a judge, you have to understand motions. You have to understand what is the fiat in that motion and what is the burden of teams in that motion. So in a situation where the opposition team is coming to go against fiat to say, oh, at the end of the day, banning is not going to happen. You have to understand as a judge that fiat exists, and the proposition side obviously have that fiat to assume that the banning itself will happen. But then you have to judge the debate from the point of view of how exactly is this banning solving the biggest issues in the debate. Is it the team that said they will ban or the team that said they will not ban? It means as a judge, if I were this judge, what I would have typically said is, okay, there was a clash as to whether the ban will happen or not. I was incentivized to have to vote for the proposition side winning that particular clash because they had the fiat to be able to give that to be able to make that fiat, considering the fact that this debate was not necessarily about if ban will happen or not. It is more about if ban will solve probably problem A, problem B, and problem C that was the biggest issues both teams were trying to solve in the debate. So yeah, that is one major way you can be able to probably give that particular feedback in itself. You have to be clear to them that as the opposition side, your burden is not to go against the fiat, but to make that concession and show why that ban in itself or not banning in itself is probably going to lead to all of the solutions to the problems they are all trying to solve within that particular debate. So hopefully this answers Daniel's question that he asked in the chat space. Does that answer your question, Daniel? Okay, sure. Thank you very much. So let's move to the next part. Of out before we then think of ending this call essentially. I'm so sorry guys, there's power outage in my city, so and my lamp is going dull. So you might probably not be able to see me for a while. Probably I should just turn off my camera. Just pay attention to my voice. That's what necessarily matters at the end of the day. So yeah, moving on. Let's talk about weighing debates necessarily and what exactly weighing debate is. So the first thing I want us to establish when we are talking about weighing debates is weighing debates goes hand in hand with comparisons. I don't think I have ever witnessed a debate where weigh-ups were done and then it was done without comparisons. What does comparison really mean? Comparisons generally just mean, I think it's straightforward, just generally mean probably giving a summary of things that comes from your team, and then giving a summary of things that probably came from other teams in the debate, and then trying to establish points in time as to which your own arguments were probably more better than the arguments that came from other teams. Most of the time, you find that it is the second speakers who most of the time give weights and comparisons in debates, and most especially either the deputy speakers or the whip speakers. And most of the time, you find out that weigh up and comparisons also comes in times of concessions and engagement. Whenever rebuttals are being made, that is when you find teams trying to give some types of comparisons as to, oh, they probably said this is what we are saying, and this is why we necessarily think it is better. So weigh up in itself generally just means after you give a summary of both speeches, you are now trying to, imagine a balanced scale. You're then trying to make sure that your own side of the debate essentially is probably tipping the debate in favor of your side. It's probably tipping in favor of your side. That is what weigh up generally just means, essentially. So basically, it is showing the judges why your arguments are the most important arguments in the debate and how they contribute differently to the clashes that are existing in that debate. It is clarifying to the judges your team stance and the big issues you are solving in the debate. This is the thing that I also think most of the time happens to most speakers within debate sessions, and it always also, it kind of also probably happens to me sometimes. You find out that there are a lot of times you're in debate rounds and you're being carried away with your arguments. You're not necessarily paying attention to what is the end goal of this debate. What is that very big issue this debate is trying to solve? Most of the time, when you try to keep your focus on that particular aspect, you begin to realize that at every point in time, you are trying to tell judges that all of these arguments I've given you, all of this argument that came from the team is something that contributes to this particular problem or probably solves this particular problem essentially. It means that you find yourself most of the time having to give that clarity to judges, to have to tell judges, aha, at the end of the day, we made this argument, and this is why it is solving this particular issue in the debate. So please try as much as possible to always make sure that as a team, you focus on the solutions to particular problems existing in that debate. You always have to have an end goal that you're trying to achieve essentially. Your speeches must have an end goal. A lot of time as a judge, I listen to some speeches and I begin to wonder, okay, what exactly are you trying to prove here? You are not solving probably the problem of accountability. You are not solving the problem of probably sustainability. Then what exactly is your speech contributing to the debate? You just find out that a lot of arguments were probably run in isolation. A lot of arguments probably are inconclusive. There are no way up and comparisons to necessarily show what exactly those arguments were contributing to the debate and what they were bringing that were so unique enough to be able to make us want to give the win, or probably want to credit that argument on a very higher level. It means that as a team, your prep time, one of the things you always have to identify, like I've said, is what is the biggest issue that this debate is trying to solve, and how exactly do we prove to the judges that these probably 2-3 arguments are at the end of the day solving these particular issues. That is why you begin to understand that you're weighing up and you're necessarily being comparative in the debate. It means that you begin to find out that your speeches turn out to be more strategic and more prioritized at the end of the day. Remember at the beginning of this session, I said something around how when you begin to look at debates in isolation, you can probably have 10 arguments that are trying to prove why you should do or not do something in that debate. But at the end of the day, when you now begin to look at what exactly is this debate about, when you're now beginning to look at how you can comparatively argue those debates or how you can weigh up essentially, you begin to realize that some particular arguments at the end of the day are not important for you to win the debate, because there is nothing to weigh it up against. Either there was no engagement from the opposing team, or your team already kind of considered to that particular argument, or the opposing team kind of considered to that particular argument at the end of the day. It necessarily means essentially that you then begin to realize that, oh, there's probably nothing to weigh up here. But just the way I told you, that you have to engage arguments that teams probably spent a lot of time arguing, or probably has or arguments that gives a whole lot of impact to teams. That is also the same way that you also have to probably weigh up those particular arguments, show why your own arguments are probably creating bigger impacts, or impacts that are targeted to probably vulnerable people within society, or impacts that are more urgently provided as opposed to their own impact. Or you probably weigh up to show why, at the end of the day, in comparisons, your own arguments probably, solves a particular issue in a way that their own arguments doesn't solve. So there is a technique as to which you can probably weigh a debate. Most of the time, when you listen to debate rounds, you find a whole lot of speakers trying to weigh their debate in that technique. One is to establish the now. That is, how does the debate looks like now, or how does the world you are being debating looks like now? Then the next thing is to talk about your action. So you'll be like, oh, panel, notes, the debate right now is a world, or the world right now is a world where abortion is being carried out. Then the action is talk about the change that you are proposing in that debate. So the action here is that we want to ban it. So panel notes, in the world right now, there's already abortion. People are dying from abortion, or we are losing innocent life of unborn babies. The action right now is that we are going to ban it. You probably talk about the mechanisms or the policies you proposed as to how you necessarily want to ban it. And then, what is the outcome? What does the world look like at the point in time where this change has been made? It means that you probably have less loss of life, either unborn children or women. It means that you probably have a world where people don't have unprotected sex to an extent where it becomes dangerous to society. Like, these are a lot of things that you can then begin to use to generally just prove or to weigh up why exactly you are comparatively winning that debate. So the thing is now, action, and then. Those are the three ways you use to comparatively win or weigh up your debates. Now, action, and then. A lot of time you find teams run arguments and then they just leave it at that. A lot of time you find speakers probably say something like, oh, panel, their world is the status quo, but this is why our own world is better than the status quo. In their own world, which is something that is a status quo, which is kind of like now, these are things that are happening. But whenever we take this particular action, these are the differences it makes, which is better than the difference in their own world, or something that is already existing right now that we necessarily think is a problem or is not a solution to that particular action, essentially. So in summary, I have just told you about weighing debates. And weighing debate is actually very straightforward, because you begin to realize that you weigh debates by generally just explaining to the judges that the particular argument that came from your team is comparatively better than the arguments that came from the opposing team. Generally just explaining to them that, at the end of the day, all of these arguments we bring probably have bigger impact, or principally it is better justified, or whatever plethora of reasons you can probably have to just prove to the judges why they should be buying your argument as opposed to the argument of the opposing team, essentially. So this is how weighing debate generally looks like. And the ways as to which you can necessarily comparatively weigh debate is to show now, how does the world look like now in your own end and now on their own end? How does the world look like after your action has been taken and their own action has been taken? But then, what is the outcome of those actions on both ends? What happens in their own world whenever they take an action? And what happens in your own world whenever you take your own action? And how does that impact then generally get better within society? So yeah, this is like the ABC, or the 1, 2, 3 of having to weigh debates. There are a lot of technical ways as to which you can strategically weigh debates. But then this is just like a basic way that most times you can easily follow up or follow through with in debate rounds. So yeah, if you have a question, now is also the best time to probably ask your question. Please just unmute and ask. I always like sessions where people are asking questions because it always makes me confident that people were listening to me. But if at the end of over 1 hour of speaking, nobody's asking me a question, I begin to get quite scared that uh, probably no one listened to me. So please, don't allow me go dive deep into my insecurities. Please ask your questions. Okay. I'm going to probably ask a question. Do you think that POIs are also a way of engagement or concessions or way up? Do you think POIs can be a tool of concessions or way up or engagements? Please unmute right now to let's just kind of have a discussion around it. If you think that it's not a way, you can tell me, unmute and tell me your reason why. If you think it is a way, you also need to unmute and tell me why. Or in fact, let me just call anybody randomly. Makota, Ishenopa Makota. I hope I'm not butchering your name. Do you think POIs are ways of engagement or concessions or way ups? Or do you think they can be a tool of engagement, concessions, or way ups? Makota, please, let me hear your point of view on that. Makota. Okay, Ishmael, can you help Makota out? Can you explain why you necessarily, if you think POIs are tools for concessions, engagements, or way ups?
Well, am I clear?
Oh yes, you're clear.
So,
Okay, you repeat the question, ma'am. I didn't get the question.
Okay, please give a moment, Koviko. Ishmael, my question was, do you think POIs are tools of concessions, engagements, and way ups?
as is reasoning, let me give a response, please.
Okay, yeah.
So, I think that POIs are a way that it shows an engagement that we have an interconnection to the debate, and we are understanding what the opponent is talking about, and we want to put in an engagement to show out that we want to challenge them. That's why I think POIs are a way of engagement, and they are really necessary for speakers to have to raise POIs in every argument that is being presented by their opponents.
Sure, yeah. Koviko, you're quite right, actually. In fact, let me give you a clap.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me give you a clap. Sure. So the thing is, Makota and Koviko is right. POIs are tools of engagement and concessions, because a lot of times I listen to debate rounds and you see teams just asking randomly abstract questions in debate rounds. So they just come up and say, "Oh, do you think that this is this, or do you think that that is that?" A lot of times the questions at the end of the day are so redundant that they are not effectively creating any form of engagement. The reason why POIs exist in debate rounds is for you to be able, for teams to be able to, you know, efficiently engage with each other. So a lot of times when you listen to top debate rounds, you begin to see the extent as to which POIs most of the times are able to flip debate in favor of some particular teams. How is that so? One, you find some people having to use POIs as a form of concession. So they begin to say things like, see, panel, at the end of the day, you find this particular team making arguments around this particular aspect, but we concede that all these particular things can happen on either side of the debate. The debate is now about if this particular thing should be done, or if this particular thing should not be done, or if it is probably going to lead to this particular benefit or not. A lot of times, even if the judges is at the brinks of having to favor that particular team that is debating at that point in time, your POI that just made a concession as to, oh, at the end of the day, all of these things that this particular speaker is saying is correct and totally true, but it's not just the most important thing in debate, makes judges now begin to understand that even though this team is saying this, it is probably not engaging with the burden of the debate, and that is the reason why you should probably not, so much overtly rate their speech to an extent where you probably want to give them a ranking that is probably first or second. So yeah, at this point in time, you've just seen someone use a POI to make a concession, but then begin to show where they are totally disagreeing in that debate. That is what we call an agree to disagree kind of mechanism. But another way you can also use a POI as a form of engagement is probably to point out to the judges that, oh, you are outrightly disagreeing with something. This is most of the time so easy for diagonal teams, either OO versus CG, or which is most of the time so important, OG versus CO. You notice in a debate that a lot of times OG most of the time don't have that particular luxury to be able to directly engage with CO. At that point in time, POIs becomes important for engagement. It necessarily means that you have to be like, oh, I have a POI, and then probably point out something that is so critical in your own speech and generally shows why it is engaging, or it is in response, either it is a rebuttal or it is an answer to probably a lot of issues that CO is dealing with that particular debate essentially. It means that most of the time when they are asking you to take strategic questions that are critical to you winning the debate, either making concessions to then show where disagreement should exist in that debate, or generally just showing where you think your team, your argument is engaging with their argument, either a rebuttal or a response, or generally just probably a logic that comes from your team that just disproves the logic that comes from their own team, essentially. Yeah, Koviko, you raised your hands. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I've got a question. As you just explained that debate, raising POIs is a way of concession, and then there is also one question which I've got, which is talking about that. How can we set a rhetorical question when we're raising a POI? Because I've got to hear from many debaters, they're talking about rhetorical questions, that they are the questions which are necessary in a debate. So I would like to have you.
I'm not sure I get your question actually. You said you want to know how you use a POI to do what?
How to raise a rhetorical question.
Rhetorical questions.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. I think a way of asking rhetorical questions, if I think I get what you're trying to say, is probably to ask a question that just generally shows the flawness in the logic that they're trying to ask. I think a way to do that is to probably think, okay, what is the summary of these particular speakers, or within the first, or at this point, or right from the beginning of the speech of this speaker to this very point in time that they are probably speaking, what have they been trying to prove? Then you probably now ask a question to just generally show them that all those things they're trying to prove can generally just be dislodged by that particular question you've just asked. So, for example, this house will ban abortion. Proposition side is giving a whole lot of argument. Oh, at the end of the day, we necessarily want to ban abortion because it is injurious to the health of women, but we also think that a lot of innocent lives are being lost, and all those typical arguments that comes from banning of abortion. You as the opposition side can then ask a question like, oh, speaker, do you necessarily think that all women die from all? Do you necessarily do you think that all women who does abortion die? You are just generally showing to the judges and to that particular speaker that at the end of the day, there is a high chance or there is an existence of women who carry out abortion and don't die. This just necessarily invalidates the crux of the argument that is coming from that particular team, which is to say, at the end of the day, that irrespective of whether women carry argument or from making your constructive argument, as the case may be. You have every right to tell the judges panel, I can't answer this POI because this POI is not relevant to this debate, or this POI doesn't necessarily answer the question of if we should solve a particular issue or not. But note, you have to listen to that POI clearly to see if that question is totally irrelevant as you think it is. Make sure that it is an irrelevant question before you begin to move on to say you are not answering it. But in terms of asking, many times POIs cannot be asked just randomly. You have limited options. Like, you probably ask your POI 5 times before the speaker asks you, or rather before the speaker answers you. So it means that you have to make sure that you're prioritizing. At that point in time, the speaker can be making a very relevant argument that you probably need to engage with, but then you choose to ask a rhetorical question, which at the end of the day is totally not strategic. So at the end of the day, it all boils down to strategy. Most of the time, asking rhetorical questions just to confuse speakers exists in debate rounds where there is a mixture of very, very pro speakers and probably novice speakers. That necessarily means that at the end of the day, you find pro speakers asking those questions just to necessarily confuse this particularly novice speaker. But you, as a novice speaker, there is a very low chance that you are probably going to ask a question that confuses your pro speaker, or ask a question that confuses your fellow novice speaker. So in terms of strategy, that might not be the best thing for you to do. However, as a novice speaker, the best strategy for you will probably to engage in the most relevant cases that is coming from that particular team, irrespective of whether they are a pro team or novice team. That gives you a higher chance of winning that particular POI and engaging with that particular POI. But then don't lose confidence whenever the speaker asks you a POI. Just slightly, not outrightly say, oh, I don't know the answer to this question and I'm not going to answer it. Maybe you can just slightly say, okay, at the end of the day, just probably repeat your argument and then say something like, oh, my panel will fully engage this in their speech, or rather my second speaker will fully engage this in their speech. What that necessarily means is you've just indirectly told your second speaker to begin to think to answers towards that particular question, essentially, so that before they come up to give their speech, you have probably found an answer to it, and in their own speech, either as a rebuttal or as a direct case construction, they probably engage that particular POI, essentially. So a lot of times you find speaker comes to say something like, oh, during my first speaker speech, the opening opposition or the closing opposition asked this particular POI. This is the response towards that particular POI, or this is why this particular argument my speaker gave responds towards that particular POI. But then don't lose confidence whenever they ask you a POI you don't know the answer to. You can just slightly say, oh, this argument I am analyzing probably engages with that particular POI, but then say you get more engagement from my partner. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, I've got a lot.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So Jen says something in the chat space. Jen says, what is the best way to go in engaging clashes, especially as a whip speaker? Okay, yeah. The primary role of a whip speaker at the end of the day is to, one, rebut the arguments that comes from other teams within that particular debate. So the thing is, you can probably be a government whip speaker, and then you realize that both opening opposition and closing opposition has similar cases. You can decide to engage them as a whole. So, for example, both of them have clashes on accountability, both of them have clashes on, sustainability, and both of them have clashes on probably inclusivity. You can say something like, oh, panel, at the end of the day, both closing opposition and opening opposition tried to, they contributed these particular ways to these three clashes. At the end of the day, this is our own case, and this is why our case engages with those three clashes, and this is why we generally win above closing opposition and opening opposition. But there are points in time where closing opposition and opening opposition might be running slightly different clashes. So, for example, closing opposition can be running inclusivity, and opening opposition might be running sustainability. You can now decide to take it team by team. You say, okay, panel, the clash that existed from opening opposition is probably sustainability. This is our contribution to that clash, and this is why we are winning above that clash. Then you can say, oh, for closing opposition, they had two clashes. Their first clash was on accountability. This is our contribution to accountability, and this is why our contribution wins that debate. So I've just shown you two methods as to which you can engage. The first method, or rather, all this method depends on how the debate plays out, or how teams plays out in that particular debate. There are particular debates where both opening and closing team share the same clashes. You can then now engage those clashes on a very broad level. But there are times where both teams will be having slightly different clashes. Maybe one team is arguing sustainability and the other team is arguing accountability. You as the speaker can now decide to say, aha, at the end of the day, you take it team by team. You engage the opposition team, engage the closing opposition team, and then probably show why you are winning above your opening. So those are ways you can have engagement as a whip speaker. Please, as a whip speaker, don't make that mistake of forgetting how you win above your opening. Just as you are weighing and just as you are being comparative and you are weighing up against your opposing team, you also have to be comparative and weigh up against your opening to show why the arguments that came from them are not enough or are not comparatively better than your own arguments, and why your argument weighs above or generally wins the debate as opposed to their own argument. So, Jane, does this answer your question?
Yeah, essentially. Thank you.
You're welcome. Makota says, I am a learning speaker from Zimbabwe. I have heard feedback saying a team has won as it managed to split the case. What does that mean? Okay, let me try to read the question again to see if I get you. Say, I have heard feedback from a feedback saying a team has won as it managed to split the case. What does that mean? Okay, I don't get what split the case generally means. Can you try to unmute to just try to explain what you're asking?
Okay, hello. I literally don't understand as well because they were just saying that this team managed to split the case. Of course, among other things like characterization and other things, but they said it is splitted the case. So I really don't understand what it meant as well.
Okay, I also don't. Okay, I also don't think I get what that means. But most of the time, it is advisable that whenever judges gives you justifications like this, you have to ask feedback. You have to ask them to explain what they mean by splitting the case, because it means is the judge of that particular round that is in the best position to explain to you things like splitting the case. But sincerely, I've never really heard a debate where someone won because they split the debate, because I am still trying to understand what split the debate generally means. But to the contribution that Abu Hanifa is giving to say winning after shafting, most of the time it is always difficult for teams to win by shafting, because there is a rule in the WUDC manual against closing teams having to shaft their opening. So it means that you generally can't go against the definitions or context that comes from your opening team, or else that will be considered shafting, and judges are required to not consider that as a metric as to which the debate should be judged on. So there's a higher chance that if a team shafted in a debate, they have there's a high chance that they most likely don't win debates. They can win the debates, but there's a high chance that they won't win that debate because they shafted. Because most of the materials that come from your shafted characterization will not be prioritized within that particular debate, essentially. That is a new rule that was probably added to the or either EUDC or WUDC manual this year. But sure, whenever you get OA from judges where they tell you particular things, you have the right to question them in feedback and ask them why they necessarily said that and what that necessarily means essentially. But sure, this is I hope this probably answers your question, um Makota. If you probably have the contact of the judge, I would advise that you reach out to that judge and tell them to please explain to you what splitting the case necessarily means and how that played out in the debate where they judged you. So, okay, yeah, Koviko, you're raising your hands again.
Yeah, well, I think I have an idea about splitting the case.
Okay.
About splitting the case, what I understand is that when the judge talks about splitting the case, it means that you arrange your arguments in ways. Like let's say there are two different topics which you are arguing about, and then after you clarify them in different distinct ways, which is not under the same argument, but there may be two arguments for a reason. Split them apart. That's what I think. I understand by splitting them.
Okay, I couldn't get you clearly because of your background noise. Can you please repeat it?
Well, I'm talking about that when we're talking about split the case is when we get when we're talking about a certain argument, which are two, we split it into two ways, a two-way side, but which is distinct, so that we may present the case separately apart from the other. Let's say we are arguing about political parties being eliminated in the country of Uganda. Then I get it in two ways. I say that due to nepotism, we are uh, we are we are sanctioning the political party. We also bring in another argument, and then we say we bring in another argument. Always been a threat to the people, since they have always been promoting violence. It is one case which we are presenting, but we are presenting it in a two-way side under two arguments. So in the case is when it's one case being presented under two arguments which are distinct, which are separate. I think I don't know if I'm clear.
Okay, I think I get you. If I get what you're trying to say, you say splitting the case means a particular team decided to focus on a particular aspect of the argument and probably show why that particular aspect in itself is more relevant in the debate. Am I right?
Yeah, you're right. And then,
Okay.
as you just said, it is done in a two-way side. Two arguments are presented outside, but it is the same case which they are tackling about in their argument.
Okay. Jane, is this what you think happened in that particular debate round where you were in? Is Jane still on the call? Okay, yeah, I am just going to assume that is what happened. Yeah, that is the thing. There are some particular debate round where a particular team can decide to focus on a particular minute set of the debate. It is always so easy for closing teams to do that. What that necessarily means is they look at the most vulnerable sect of people within that particular debate, or a very targeted sect of problem in that debate and show why they are solving and why it is the biggest issue to solve. How is that so? So, for example, they are arguing this has to ban abortion, and probably the opening governments gave a whole lot of arguments. We want to protect lives, we want to do this. Closing governments can come and say, oh, we concede to everything that has come from our opening, but due to these particular mechanisms or metrics or policies, we at the end of the day don't just protect every random person within society, but we probably protect women and children who are the most vulnerable people within this debate. Most of the time, those particular metrics are chosen based on vulnerability, or are chosen based on, are chosen based on vulnerability, or are chosen based on who is best able to solve a particular problem within that society. Either the problem is more rampant, or it happens to some vulnerable people, or minorities within society, or it generally just solves the issue in a way that is more peculiar and more strategic. It means that if that is so, there's a possibility that that particular thing that, in quotes, splits the case, or that directly targetly solved a particular problem, would most likely win that debate, because their problem is more specific, more practical, and more easy to follow, as opposed to a debate where you just give it broadly. And that is why Way Up becomes a very strategic tool as to which you can use to win a debate, because your debate is not just broad, but it is more targeted and more convincing or practical or easy to follow. Do you now understand, Koviko?
Yeah, thank you. I understand.
Yes. Okay, cool. So this is the last call for questions. Final questions. Any other question?
Yeah, I think I have one. And then
Okay.
my question is that because I came late, I joined late the meeting, I would like you to just briefly explain to me how I can wait. Just brief and brief. I beg.
Okay, Way Up. Okay, yeah. I think Way Ups at the end of the day, as I said, is generally just being comparative. It means you have to like give a summary of the debate, kind of. If you are a whip speaker most of the time, this is what you do. You give a summary of the debate by giving what came from your team and what came from the opposition team, but generally just showing why your own arguments are better than the arguments that came from their side, or your impact are better than what the impacts that came from their own side generally. But most times you find most strategic speakers weighing up at the end of every of their arguments. They'll generally say, okay, now this is how the status quo look like on both ends or both worlds. This is the action being carried out on both worlds, and this is why the outcomes are different on both worlds, and our own outcome is better than their own outcome. Like I said, there is the now, the action, and the outcome, or the then, to generally just weigh up and compare, just generally explain to judges why argument or your team case is something that is better and should win the debate above every other team within that particular debate. Does that explain what weigh up and comparison is to you?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much.
Yes, you're welcome. Okay. So I believe this should be a good way and a good time for us to round up this particular session. I am happy for the discussions and engagements that happened in this session. It was wonderful having to listen to the ideas that came from you all. And I thank you all once again for listening to what I have to say. It's made my evening, and wishing you best of luck in the debate tournaments. Hoping to see you all topping the tabs, or just generally seeing you all being progressive with your growth. So irrespective of whether you tab or not, or whether you top the tab or not, just make sure that you are not the way you were when you started the tournament. You probably did better with your way ups, or you probably did better with your engagement. Yeah. To answer Abu Anifa's question, are there slides to this? Unfortunately, no. I couldn't have time to make a slide. I kind of had a material that just kind of outlined things I was going to say. I would probably share that to Enoch, but it is just very skeletal. So it doesn't have a lot of explanation I gave, since most of the explanation I gave came off the top of my head. But I'm probably just going to share it, maybe the skeletal, jotted things I made in my documents is probably going to make you remember some things I had to say to that essentially. So yeah, have a nice evening, everyone. Wishing you best of luck in tournaments you're going to have after now. And yeah, have fun. Goodbye. Who is the handler? Enoch. Um, I am done with this session. Whosoever the admin is or handler, yeah, I am done. You can round up now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the session. Unless I